Tonight we welcome Republican presidential candidate, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee to our center seat. Asking the questions tonight, Charles Lane, opinion writer for the Washington Post, Amy Walter, national editor for the Cook Political Report, and Charles Hurt, political columnist for the Washington Times. Governor, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You know, it's been an interesting couple of days as we're learning more about this situation in San Bernardino, even though we now know from officials in the U.S. government that at least one of these shooters pledged allegiance to ISIS. And there are many other connections that are being talked about. The White House again today was reticent to call it terrorism as of yet. And in fact, Josh Earnest went back to an argument he made yesterday. Just take a listen to today.
Why on earth do we think it's a good idea for somebody that the government thinks is too dangerous to board a plane be allowed to buy a gun? Doesn't make any sense. But once again, Republicans block legislation that would make that illegal.
Your reaction to that and the White House response?
Was there any indication that either one of these shooters were unable to board a plane? No, there was not. In fact, they were fully vetted. They were able to come back into the country. She had a passport. She had a visa. This nonsense that, well, they wouldn't have been able to buy guns. This is the false argument that this White House has made in an attempt to dodge the real issue. There are people who are trying to kill us. They're Islamic jihadists. And I don't know why they can't just come up and say it. They wouldn't say it after Little Rock. They wouldn't say it after Fort Hood. They wouldn't say it after Oklahoma City. You have Boston Marathon. How many times does this have to happen? He keeps asking us, how many times do we have to have mass shootings to get gun control? I'd like to ask him, how many times do we have Islamic jihadist terrorist attacks and him not be able to acknowledge what we're fighting against?
Well, on the specific issue, since they keep coming back to it, what about someone on the terrorist watch list? Should they be allowed to buy a gun?
Well, the problem is most of the time it is a name, not a background. It's not the full identity. So I've had friends, I'm sure all of us have, friends who ended up on that list because their name was the name of somebody that might have a suspicion. Not necessarily even so much as a probable cause. But they were on the no-fly list, and it took them months, if not a couple of years, to get off of it. In the meantime, their lives were a living hell. Now, why would you put people through that if you can't, at that point, really say that this is a person you're suspecting of terrorist activity or even suspecting of criminal activity?
Charlie.
Governor, you know, we've seen this in Paris and in San Bernardino, this concept of the more homegrown jihadists. It's kind of, you know, more alarming, I think, than when they're foreign. How do you get at that as a government?
How does the government get to that? I'm not sure that the government ever can completely understand what causes a person to be that demented, that off his rocker. Because I don't think that any rational, sane person can think in those terms, except that if you are a religious fanatic about something and you believe that it is your God-given duty to go out and kill people because they're infidels, then you can convince yourself. But then it becomes a theological issue, not just a psychological issue.
Amy.
I want to just pull it back to talk about ISIS in a broader sense. We've had a lot of discussion now with the Republican candidates taking sides about what to do about Assad. Mm-hmm. Keep him there. At least he helps fill a vacuum that would get filled without him there with radical jihadists, or take him out. Where are you on this?
Assad is not our immediate problem. Assad has not killed or kidnapped Americans. The Iranians have, and we made a deal with them. That doesn't make sense to me. It makes more sense to me to not worry as much about Assad, even though I don't trust him, I don't like him, and I don't think he's a good guy. But our immediate threat is the Islamic Jihad, not only branch of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram, but those that are beheading Christians, that are infiltrating the United States and doing dastardly deeds like we saw in San Bernardino. I have the same attitude about Russia and Putin. I know many of my Republican colleagues say, I don't trust Russia, I don't trust Putin, we shouldn't have anything to do with them. Look, my feeling is if the Russians and Putin are willing to go after ISIS members and kill them, we should not get in their way. In fact, we should thank them for being willing to do that. We'll fight the battles that we have with them another day on another platform. Right now, the immediate threat we have is let's get rid of this malignant cancer and cut it out before it metastasizes and kills more Americans.
Well, I was going to pick up on that because it's really not that simple. Russia, as we know, is not really striking ISIS targets so far in Syria. And also, Russia doesn't do anything for free. So my question to you would be this. To get Russia actually to fight ISIS instead of talking about it, which is what they're doing now, what what would you be willing to trade? If Vladimir Putin came to you and said, we want you to back off of the Baltics, we want you to back off in Ukraine, we want help with this, that, and the other of our concerns, what would you be willing to give him?
Well, I'm not sure that we're in a position where we want to give him anything. I think it's a matter of making sure that he understands that the only reason we welcome him to the world stage without contempt is because he would like to do something in return and retaliation for ISIS knocking down an airliner with 224 of his people on board. That doesn't mean anything to him.
He's not doing anything militarily to ISIS.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true. I'm not sure that he is doing nothing to fight ISIS. He may not be doing what we want him to do. He may not be doing what we wished he would do. But to say that Russia has no interest at all in taking any of the people from ISIS out, I don't necessarily agree.
Just one final. So in return for the little bitty thing he's doing against ISIS right now, you'd be prepared to say, let Assad, who is butchering all these people and driving them into Europe as refugees, leave him in power, just in return for that little bitty tiny thing.
It's not a matter of thinking that he's doing a wonderful job and we should leave him there and let's give him a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm just saying that he is not the immediate target that we need to focus upon. If there are two houses, one's on fire and one isn't, where do you put the water? You put the water on the one that's raging in flames. Right now what's raging in flames is ISIS is cutting people's heads off. ISIS is gaining ground. They're not contained. That's where we need to take the fire truck, and that's where we need to put the water.
Governor Mike Huckabee is in our center seat tonight. Governor, you are a proponent of the fair tax.
Yes.
And there are many critics of the fair tax. One of them is AEI's Alan Viard, and he calls the fair tax, quote, a big shift in the tax burden away from high-income groups towards middle-income, lower-income groups. And whatever you think about that politically, I think that's just not viable.
Well, he's wrong, and he takes the same position that a lot of people have taken without understanding the actual fair tax, most of which comes from a study that the Bush administration did on tax policy. They looked at a consumption tax. They didn't actually look at the fair tax, so they think they did. The fair tax empowers people at the bottom third of the economy most of all, by about 14-15%. People in the middle third of the economy benefit 7 or 8%. It's the people at the top who benefit the least, still 4 or 5%. But because there's a provision in the fair tax, called a prebate, but essentially untaxes poor people from their basic necessities, that it is the single most empowering approach to taxation. It's bold, it's different, and it brings jobs back to the very people in those middle class areas who don't have them right now.
But on the back end of that, it's viable. Is it viable? Because you have to get something through this Congress,
yes,
and you know how Washington works.
Yeah.
The big idea is
it's not viable unless you have a president who can explain it, sell it, and lead it, because it isn't going to happen. There's 80 current congressional sponsors of the fair tax with the bill that's in place. But it's not going to happen if you just have congressional support. It's only going to happen if you have a president that actually can go out there and help the American people to see what this does to bring working capital back to America, get manufacturing jobs back, and also help alleviate the economic incentive of illegal immigration, which the fair tax would help do.
Amy.
I want to talk about two of your proposals, Social Security and ethanol subsidies. Yes. In both cases, you're arguing we don't need to have major reform, structural reform on Social Security and Medicare, and that you want to continue the ethanol subsidies. How do you square that with a philosophy that also government's too big and that our deficit's too high? How do you not have to tackle both of those things?
Well, let's take Social Security first. That's not the government's money. People paid that in. Every paycheck I ever had since the age of 14 when I started working, no one asked me if I wanted to give that money into an account for the Social Security fund. It was taken out of me. Now you have people who are approaching the age of retirement, Social Security benefits, and then somebody says, hey, we're going to extend the age at which you retire. Oh, and by the way, we're going to means test you. All that money that you put in, you may not need it after all. Well, talk about big government. How big government is it when the government makes the decision for me to take the money and then makes the decision not to give it to me after I've paid it in?
Do you believe we can continue on this path that we're on right now without reform?
If our economy were growing at 4% a year, just 4%, I think we can do better than that, but at 4%, we fully fund Social Security and Medicare. We've got more people talking about how we need to cut benefits for seniors and how we need to rid ourselves of these programs that people have depended on Social Security alone, you've got 70 million people who depend upon that. More than a third of them, that's 90% of their income. Rather than talking about how to trim those benefits from them, why don't we talk about growing the economy, giving everybody's boat higher water to float in? That makes a whole lot more sense to me.
But on the second part, Larry Lawyer writes in on Twitter, he says, adulterating our gasoline with ethanol is a bad idea for everyone except corn farmers. Why support it?
Well, first of all, the government mandated it, and the government encouraged people to go out and build this extraordinary infrastructure to take care of not just ethanol, but biofuels, which are renewable. I mean, green people ought to love this. The result has been 16% lower cost in energy for the consumer and a greener outcome. So on one hand, you have people saying, well, you know, this is what the government mandated. This is a classic bait and switch from Washington. They mandated, billions of dollars are spent to create the infrastructure to deliver biofuels, and then the next thing you know, the government says, we were just kidding. So all these people who've made the investments, we're going to gut punch them again. This is why people hate Washington.
All right, so it's not about Iowa? It's not about votes at the caucus?
I was saying the same thing when I wasn't a candidate, and I was saying the same thing before I was a presidential candidate.
Charlie.
Well, it is interesting, though, that you had an op-ed this morning in the Des Moines Register, and I was wondering why it appeared in the Des Moines Register, but I think I know why.
Look, I'm not going to kid you. I'm trying to win Iowa, okay? Let's not be coy about that. But it's not that the position on that was just because of the election.
Okay, but at a time, and you yourself have just said this, you know, at a time when energy prices are falling, a lot of this innovation appears to be working on its own now. Why do I need to subsidize? Why does the taxpayers in the rest of the country have to subsidize this?
Ultimately, I think if you look at long term, we won't need subsidies. But in the meantime, as we're developing the extraordinary necessary infrastructure to make this work, my goal is to see us become the #1 energy exporter in the world. Do you have any idea what would happen if we changed the balance of power, if we became the exporter of energy to Europe, Africa, and Asia, and we took that market away from Russia, the Saudis, and the Iranians? We don't just improve the American economy, we transform the very essence of balance of military power itself.
Would you say you're in favor of phasing out subsidies for ethanol?
In the long term, if they're no longer needed, to make sure that people whose investments have been made, I just don't think you build this infrastructure, you cause people to follow a mandate, and then you just change the mandate in the middle. That's like changing the rules of the football game at halftime while the guys are in the locker. That's crazy.
We're back with our panel. Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee. Governor, you look at the latest poll out today, CNN ORC. You are at 2% in this poll. Donald Trump's at 36% in the newest poll. The RCP, the Real Clear Politics average of recent polls, you're at 2.3%. Again, up against 30.8%. And in Iowa, where you just said you'd like to win, you're at 1.7%. How do you tell supporters that there's a path when you look at these polls?
Well, the path is the way it's been for the past several election cycles. I was at a number worse than this 8 years ago. Rick Santorum was at a number worse than that 4 years ago. We both ended up winning the Iowa caucuses. Both of us ended up coming in
7 days out of the caucuses, you were that
absolutely. And that's what people tend to forget. You know, this is going to be a later caucus because now we're going to be February rather than early January. And so there's 60 days before we actually start voting. In the meantime, you know, Trump's got a great lead, but we're a long way from that moment. And historically, it doesn't mean that if you're leading now, you're going to be leading when the votes get counted.
Chuck.
Well, you know, a lot of people in the party are saying the problem with our field, and the reason, or one of the reasons Trump is running away from it, is there's so darn many candidates. And you are just above an asterisk. Several people in that neighborhood, or at least one or two of them, Bobby Jindal comes to mind, have already dropped out, saying in part, the party needs to concentrate its fire and get real. Why isn't you've been processed by the Iowa voters, as you pointed out yourself 8 years ago. Why isn't this poll really a signal that it's time to do the right thing for the party and step aside?
Would that be like asking, since some of the publications even represented around the table are not #1 in the marketplace, why don't they drop out? Why don't they quit publishing? You're using up a lot of trees, a lot of news space. Why not get out? I mean, why keep subjecting the audience to a bigger choice?
If you were losing money and
but I'm not losing money. I'm gaining ground. I'm getting still the opportunity to talk talk about issues that matter to me. And as long as that's the case, and until somebody has voted, I'm not sure why I should surrender before a single vote has been cast. I just think it's a big mistake when people start predicting. Let me ask you this. Did you think Donald Trump would be running away with the polls for as long as he has back in April of this year?
No, I did not.
Then you don't know and can't tell me who's going to be winning the Iowa caucus in 60 days.
Donald Trump
so I'm not going to drop out just because
already had his shot at the Iowa electorate a couple times in the past.
Right, but let's wait until February 1st and see how it shakes out.
Amy.
In April of this year, I said that the best candidate, most likely nominee, was going to be somebody who was a governor. Republicans electorate loves governors. But now at the top of the charts here, you got Trump, Carson, and 2 senators. And the governors have not been making much of a dent. What's going on, and is your experience not what people are looking for now?
Well, it should be, because I mean, do you want to get on an airplane that's flown by somebody who's never been in the cockpit before?
Apparently, the Republican electorate
I think
says
right
yes,
now, but look,
yes, we do.
This shows how angry people are at government, and particularly at Washington. What we have to do is remind them, I've never had a paycheck from Washington, never worked or lived in this city, so don't blame me for what this mess is. Look at what I was able to do in a very partisan, the most partisan atmosphere in the entire country. Nobody had a more lopsided legislature than me, and I think you want to put somebody who is actually sat at the desk in the executive office and made the real tough life and death decisions.
You took the pledge, Governor, but you would support a nominee in Donald Trump?
I would, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I still think he'd be a better president than Hillary Clinton. I know both of them, and believe me, I'd vote for Trump in a heartbeat. Secondly, the Republican Party asked all of us to pledge our loyalty to the party. Is it the party not going to pledge their loyalty to whichever one of us wins? If they don't, then that's absolutely unacceptable, and they should have to answer for why they don't commit up front that they will support whoever the nominee is.
Charlie.
If you were not running for the nomination, could you see yourself support with the rest of the field? Would you support Donald Trump? And when you look at so many establishment Republicans who have such a hard time, the acrimony that they have for him, why do they not understand what so many voters right now see in Donald Trump?
Well, and I would say one of the questions is, will Donald Trump throw his support to me if I get the nomination? Let's hope that happens too. Look, I've pledged I'm going to support the Republican nominee. I'm a team player, always have been. The party provides an extraordinary level of resources for us to be a part of this process. They spend millions of dollars building the party infrastructure. So we should respect that, and we should support the party and its nominee. I just think that goes both ways, and the party needs to support whoever our nominee is by the votes of the people.